For 3 evenings in a row, 5 cattle walked toward the only green grass on a drought-brown hillside, and stopped. They would graze the brittle fescue below it. They would shoulder into blackberry along the fence. They would nose around thistle beside the collapsed barn pad. But when they reached the narrow green band curving across the slope, all 5 slowed as if they had come to a fence no person could see. There was no wire, no gate, no ditch deep enough to matter, and Elise Mercer needed that grass. More than that, she needed to know why her cattle would stretch their necks across it, tear off mouthfuls, then back away without putting a hoof inside. Every gallon of water on the 31-acre place was arriving in a plastic tank behind her pickup. The shallow well had almost stopped producing. The lower pond had shrunk into a cracked bowl of mud. Hay prices were climbing before summer was even finished. If the ridge stayed dry another month, Elise would have to sell part of the herd before winter. On the 4th evening, the oldest cow approached the green strip again. She lowered her nose, sniffed, stepped forward, and froze. Then she shifted her weight backward. Elise watched the cow place both front feet on brown ground while reaching for grass 6 inches away. That was not pickiness. It was a decision. So after the cattle moved on, Elise climbed through the temporary fence and stood where they would not. At first, the ground felt normal. Then her right boot sank slightly. She shifted her weight and heard something beneath the turf. A hollow knock. Not the dull resistance of rock. Something with space under it. 3 months earlier, the farm had looked less like a bargain than a collection of problems somebody else had grown tired of paying for. The upper pasture was steep, thin, and broken by brush. The barn had lost half its roof and leaned just enough to make repair uncertain. A concrete stock trough sat crooked beside the lane, dry enough to collect leaves and dust. The well log that came with the sale described water as seasonal. The pond was stained around its banks, showing how far the water once reached and how far it had already fallen. 2 contractors had looked at the place before Elise closed on it. Both gave her versions of the same answer. Drill deeper, trench new water lines, install a larger storage tank. The numbers were not impossible for a wealthy buyer. Elise was not one. She was 52 and had spent most of her working life maintaining pumps, valves, greenhouse lines, and irrigation timers for a wholesale nursery. When the nursery consolidated operations, her job disappeared with it. She had some savings, a modest severance check, and enough stubbornness to believe that smaller could still work if every part of the system earned its place. She did not want a show farm. She wanted 5 cattle, enough grass to rotate them, a garden near the house site, and work that belonged to her again. The cattle were Dexters, compact animals that handled rough ground better than larger breeds and did not need enormous amounts of feed. Elise planned to divide the ridge with portable fencing, graze one small paddock at a time, and give each section enough rest to recover. On paper, the plan was simple. Water destroyed it almost immediately. The well produced in the cool part of the morning, then coughed air by mid-afternoon. Elise cleaned the intake, checked the pressure switch, and pulled the pump assembly far enough to confirm that the equipment was not the main problem. The water level itself was dropping. She paid for a shallow test bore higher on the property. It produced moisture, then almost nothing. The pond looked better from a distance. Up close, it was a shallow depression with a soft center and baked edges. Each week, the water line pulled farther away from the grass. By the end of the first month, Elise stopped pretending the pond would carry the cattle through summer. So she hauled water every morning. She drove 6 miles to a friend's equipment yard in the valley, filled a tank from a dependable well, climbed back up the county road, and eased the pickup into the farm lane so the load would not shove her downhill on loose gravel. Then she transferred the water into 2 temporary troughs. On hot days, she made the trip twice. A full tank changed how the truck handled. Braking distances stretched. The rear suspension sagged. On the steepest part of the lane, Elise drove slowly enough to watch grasshoppers jump out of the tire tracks. It was not difficult work once. It was expensive work every day. Fuel, time, and steep road driving turned every tank into more than water. Moving a trough meant moving the whole supply problem with it. Saving a trip could mean grazing one paddock too hard. Losing grass meant buying more hay later. Soon the missing water was deciding where the cattle could stand and which jobs Elise could finish before dark. And every contractor's answer involved money Elise did not have. By the middle of summer, Elise could see the pattern without writing it down. If hauling continued through the hottest weeks, the money reserved for winter hay and barn repair would disappear. Something would have to give. She could sell 2 cattle early. She could delay the barn. She could borrow for a deeper well. Or she could admit the farm did not have enough dependable water for the plan she had built around it. That afternoon, while moving fence on the upper slope, she noticed the hillside was contradicting everything in her notebook. Most of the pasture had faded from green to brown. The shallow soil over the ridgetop had gone first. Lower down, the better ground held on longer, but even there the grass curled at the tips. Yet one band stayed bright. It was not a round, wet patch around a seep. It was a narrow curve, in places 6 feet wide, in others barely 3. It began above the barn ruins, crossed the hill on a gentle contour, and disappeared into a patch of rushes near the old concrete trough. Elise had walked past it for weeks without seeing the shape. Now, surrounded by brown pasture, the line looked almost drawn onto the hill. Her first thought was simple: a seep. Her second thought was even simpler: good. If moisture was reaching the surface, perhaps the cattle had found one patch of forage that would stay productive until the next rain. She shifted the temporary fence so the next paddock included the green band. The cattle entered, walked straight toward the green grass, and stopped. One cow reached across for a mouthful. Another searched along the edge for a different approach. None put a foot inside. Elise walked the entire visible length after sunset. She looked for plants that might make the cattle avoid the area. Nothing obvious. She looked for yellow jacket traffic. Nothing. She checked for fresh snake sign around the rocks, though she knew that would not explain a boundary so long. She found an old horseshoe, 2 pieces of wire, and a rusted hinge near the barn pad. She removed all 3. The next evening, the cattle still stopped. On the 3rd evening, Elise brought a fiberglass fence post and began probing the green strip every few feet. Most places felt soft but ordinary. Then one push changed everything. The post went through a few inches of soil, struck something flat, slid sideways, and suddenly dropped. Elise caught it before it disappeared another foot. She pulled the post out. The lower end was wet. Not muddy from surface water. Cold wet. She raised it to her face and smelled the mineral sharpness of groundwater. She probed again 6 feet farther along. Stone, then empty space beside it. Farther down the line, the same thing. Stone, soft soil, a hollow below. The next morning she left the cattle in the lower paddock and came back with a shovel, a pry bar, a hand trowel, and more caution than curiosity. She started where the ground had sounded hollow beneath her boot. The sod lifted in dry squares except along the green band, where the roots were thick and damp. Less than a foot down, the shovel hit a flat stone. Elise scraped the soil away with the trowel. The stone had a straight edge. Beside it was another, then another. They were not random rocks. They had been laid together. She cleared a rectangle large enough to see the joints and stopped digging. The cattle's refusal had already told her that whatever lay underneath might not be stable. Elise worked the pry bar under one corner and lifted only an inch. Cool air came through the gap. She widened it carefully. Below the capstone was a narrow masonry channel, lined with fitted rock and half filled with black silt. Water moved along the bottom in a thread no wider than her finger. Elise stared at the direction of flow, not straight down the hill, sideways, following the contour. That was the first clue that the green strip was not simply a natural seep. Water wanted gravity. This channel had been built to control how gravity used it. Elise lowered the stone back into place and covered the opening with a piece of plywood until she could mark it properly. Then she walked uphill, following the green line with new eyes. Once she knew it might trace a structure, small things changed meaning. A slight shelf in the grass looked less like erosion. 3 stones sticking out of the bank appeared aligned. A cluster of rushes formed a square instead of a natural patch. Above the old barn, multiflora rows covered what Elise had assumed was a collapsed foundation. She cut into it with loppers. Thorns caught her sleeves. Dead canes snapped underfoot. After an hour, she exposed one dressed stone at a corner, then another on the opposite side. Between them was a shallow depression packed with leaves. Elise removed the debris by hand. The depression was not a foundation. It was the collapsed roof of an old spring box. Water entered through the uphill wall, not in a dramatic stream, but as steady cold seepage through gravel and stone. The box gave it somewhere to collect. At the lower wall, a clay pipe disappeared into the hillside, or tried to. Roots had entered the outlet until the pipe looked stuffed with rope. Elise touched the wet soil beside it. That was where most of the water was escaping. Instead of entering the pipe, the spring had begun leaking around the blockage. Once outside the system, the water spread through the soil above the buried channel. It kept the grass green. It also softened the ground over the capstones. Elise sat back on her heels and looked downhill. From the spring box, the green band curved toward the dry concrete trough. For the first time, she stopped seeing separate objects. Spring, green strip, buried channel, old trough. They were parts of one system. And the trough was not sitting beside the lane, because somebody happened to pour concrete there. It was waiting at the end of a route nobody could see anymore. That afternoon, Elise did something that would have seemed backward a week earlier. She stopped trying to fix the water problem. She started trying to understand it. The difference saved her from making the first big mistake. Her instinct, shaped by years of irrigation work, was to clear the blocked outlet completely and see how much water the spring could produce. She cut 2 roots, pulled away a mat of fine fibers, and heard water move inside the clay pipe. The flow increased immediately. For 10 seconds, Elise felt triumphant. Then the soil below the spring box shuddered. A dark line appeared 20 feet downslope. Water pushed up through the turf where no opening should have existed. Elise stopped. She packed the loosened outlet with a cloth plug, reducing the flow again. The dark line faded. Somewhere below, the old root was blocked or broken badly enough that sending more water into it only forced the water out through another weak point. If she had opened the spring fully, she might have flooded the channel, collapsed more capstones, or washed soil out from under the hillside. The system had not failed in one place. It had failed in a chain. So Elise changed methods. No more clearing from the top and hoping the rest still worked. She would find the route in section. She marked the spring box with flags, then used the green band and the probing post to identify likely capstones downhill. She opened windows in the sod rather than trenches, exposing only what she needed to inspect. At the first section, the masonry walls were intact but packed with silt. At the second, a clay pipe had separated at a joint. The gap was only a few inches, but it was enough for water to escape into the soil. At the third, A tree root had lifted one side of the channel and cracked a capstone. Farther down, the narrow root widened into a stone chamber roughly the size of a feed bin. Elise cleaned out leaves, sediment, and the remains of a small animal nest. The bottom of the chamber sat several inches below the outlet. That was not accidental. The water could enter, slow down, drop some of its sand and silt, then continue toward the trough, a settling chamber. Elise smiled despite herself. Whoever built the system had understood dirty water. They had not simply found a spring and pointed a pipe downhill. They had built places for problems to happen where those problems could be cleaned out. That was good design in any century. Over the next week, Elise marked every section she could trace and sketched the route in her notebook. A borrowed builder's level confirmed the one fact she needed. From spring box to trough, the system maintained enough fall for gravity to keep working. The long contour across the slope was not wasted distance. It slowed and controlled the descent before sending the water lower. She tested the route in short sections with water from her hauling tank. One test disappeared at a broken clay joint. Another reached the settling chamber but not the trough. Lower down she found a junction where one branch went toward the barn ruins, and the other continued toward livestock water. The barn branch was already broken open, so Elise capped it temporarily. Curiosity could wait. The farm needed dependable water where the cattle could reach it. The choice kept Elise focused on proof instead of curiosity. The lower branch was in better condition than she expected until it crossed under an old locust tree. There, roots had crushed 2 lengths of clay pipe so thoroughly that they came out in pieces. Elise spread the fragments on the grass. This was the point where preserving every original component stopped making sense. She was not restoring a museum exhibit. She was trying to restore the logic of the system. So she replaced only the destroyed section with modern food-safe water line, using adapters and a gravel bed so the repair could be open again later. She kept the original route. She kept the gravity fall. She kept the settling chamber. She kept the spring box. But she refused to pretend cracked clay was valuable simply because it was old. The next test almost worked. Elise fed water into the line below the spring box. The settling chamber filled. A trickle passed the repaired root section. Then, at the lower trough, one inside wall darkened. Elise crouched beside it. The old inlet pipe was still there, nearly hidden behind mineral crust and moss. A drop formed, then another. Then a thin stream began running into the concrete basin. Elise put 2 fingers under it. Cold water. Not enough to fill the trough quickly. Not enough to solve everything, but it was moving without a pump. For the first time since she bought the ridge, water was traveling downhill without her truck. She did not celebrate yet. A test from a hauling tank proved the route could carry water. It did not prove the spring could supply enough. Elise cleared the spring outlet slowly over 2 mornings. Each time she removed a little more root mass, she watched the lower weak points for new seepage. She kept the cattle fenced away from the entire green strip. At the spring box, she lifted the damaged roof stones and found that 2 had cracked. Rather than seal the structure permanently, she rebuilt the cover so sections could be removed for cleaning. She added a simple debris screen where leaves entered after storms. Then she opened the outlet enough to let the spring feed the system on its own. For an hour, nothing dramatic happened. That was exactly what Elise wanted. The settling chamber filled to the outlet height. Water moved through the repaired lower section. At the trough, the thin stream strengthened to a steady run. Elise marked the water level with chalk and came back an hour later, higher. She returned again before sunset, higher again. The next morning, some water had left through an old overflow notch in the trough wall. which meant the system had continued filling after she went home. Elise stood in the lane with her notebook and did the first calculation that made her feel less trapped. The flow was slow, but cattle did not need the entire day's water delivered in 10 minutes. A trough could refill while they grazed, rested, and moved through the paddock. Storage and time could turn a small, continuous source into a useful supply. That was the principle the old system had been designed around. The spring did not have to behave like a high-output pump. It only had to keep working. There were still limits. Elise learned them quickly. During the driest week of August, the spring weakened and the trough recovered more slowly after all 5 cattle drank. Elise kept hauled water available as backup. Leaves clogged the intake once, and fine roots began returning at the spring box. The old system reduced labor, but it still demanded maintenance, and it did not create water the ridge did not have. That limitation kept Elise from treating the discovery like a miracle. It was one dependable piece in a limited water budget. That was enough. By late summer, Elise no longer hauled water every day. During cooler stretches, the gravity line handled the lower rotation on its own. During hotter days, she supplemented it instead of supplying everything from the truck. She moved one temporary trough to the upper paddocks and left the old concrete trough in service below. The change saved fuel, but the larger effect appeared in the grass. Before the repair, Elise's grazing plan had been shaped by where the pickup could go safely with a full tank. The cattle spent too much time near the lane because that was where water was easiest to deliver. The far side of the ridge can rested longer than necessary while the accessible paddocks were grazed harder. Now the lower trough gave her another anchor point. She could move the cattle through a longer loop instead of pulling them back toward the same water source. The laneside grass began recovering more evenly. The far paddocks entered the rotation at the right stage, rather than whenever hauling happened to be convenient. Mud around the temporary tanks disappeared from places where Elise had been parking them repeatedly, and the pickup stopped making the steep water run every morning. One evening, Elise noticed the truck had stayed parked all day. For the first time, the farm had been organized around pasture work instead of a water tank. The strongest proof came with weather. In early September, a hard storm arrived after weeks of heat. Rain hammered the ridge fast enough to send brown water down the lane. Elise woke before dawn to the sound on the roof of the small trailer she was using as temporary shelter. Her first thought was the spring box. Her second was the green strip. Before daylight fully arrived, she pulled on boots and climbed the slope in rain. She expected to find the repaired system overwhelmed. Instead, the spring box was doing something she had not understood until that moment. The first dirty surge entered high and slowed and seized the stone chamber. Sediment darkened the bottom. Water reached the outlet and continued into the gravity line. But not all of it. Beside the box, a shallow stone-lined channel that Elise had assumed was erosion began carrying overflow away from the buried root. She followed it through the rain. The channel led into a grassy swale where extra water spread across a wider area before moving downhill. The builders had given the spring 2 jobs. One route for normal flow, another for too much flow. Without that overflow, stormwater would have forced itself through the livestock line or saturated the capstones again. Elise cleared leaves from the diversion and watched the water flatten into the swale. For the first time, she understood the system as more than a pipe carrying spring water. It was also a way of deciding where water should not go. The rain continued for hours. By afternoon, the lower trough was full. The lane was wet but intact, and the green strip across the hillside had changed. It did not disappear completely. Some moisture still followed the buried route. But the lush 6-foot band had narrowed into a faint trace. The soil no longer pulsed under Elise's boots. The grass was no longer advertising a leak. That was when the cattle's behavior finally made complete sense. They had not discovered a secret spring in some mystical way. They had read footing. The green grass had looked valuable because the water system was failing beneath it. Leaks had softened soil over hollow spaces. Some capstones had shifted. A heavy animal stepping through the wrong place could crack a stone, trap a hoof, or punch a leg into the channel. The cattle did not need to understand masonry. They did not need to understand hydraulic grade or settling chambers or overflow routes. They only needed to notice that the ground under that grass did not feel like the ground beside it. Elise had looked at the green band and seen forage. The cattle had treated it as information. That difference stayed with her. Not because animals were wiser than people. Because they were paying attention to a different layer of the same place. Elise had been looking for water volume, pasture color, contractor estimates, and well depth. The cattle were reading pressure through their feet. Once the system was stable, Elise searched the barn ruins for evidence of how it had been maintained. She found fragments of clay tile, a hand-forged strap that fit one surviving pipe, and a weathered wooden level with its vial missing. None gave her a name or a date, and she refused to invent either. The system could have been built and altered by different hands over many years. What survived was a method: capture a modest spring, settle its sediment, control its descent, divert storm overflow, and leave important sections accessible for cleaning. The design did not create more water. It simply wasted less of what the hill already provided. At some point, maintenance stopped. Leaves collected. Roots entered the spring outlet. Silt filled the channel. Clay shifted. Water leaked around the blockage. The trough dried. The pond and well became the obvious water sources because they were visible. The buried system became invisible because it no longer worked well enough to announce itself as a system. Then each new owner saw the same surface problem. Weak well, dry trough, steep land, expensive fix. Elise had nearly followed that logic all the way to a deeper well loan. She had called contractors. She had priced pumps. She had treated the concrete trough as an abandoned object instead of the end of a route. The only reason she stopped was that 5 cattle refused to step onto the best-looking grass on the farm. By autumn, Elise had mapped the spring box, settling chamber, livestock branch, overflow diversion, and lower trough. One unexplored branch still disappeared beneath mature roots. She left it alone. Not every hidden thing needed to be excavated. The working parts had already answered the farm's real question. Could the ridge move enough water by gravity to reduce hauling and support a better grazing pattern? Yes. Could Elise stop monitoring the system because it was old and clever? No. Could she carry more cattle simply because the lower trough worked again? Not safely. The pasture still had limits. The spring still had limits. Winter would bring freezing weather. Spring would bring roots and leaves. Another drought could reduce the flow farther than this one had. So Elise kept the notebook. But the numbers changed. Water hauling trips dropped. Fuel use dropped. Time on the lane dropped. Rest periods in the paddocks became more consistent. And for the first time, the notebook showed a system she could manage instead of a problem that grew every day. The ridge had never been easy land. The buried waterworks did not turn it into easy land now. There was still fence to repair, brush to cut, hay to buy, mud to avoid, winter feed to store, and a barn roof that had not fixed itself while Elise was digging around old stone. But the assumption beneath all that work had changed. The farm was not dry because nobody before her had known how to use the land. It was dry because one useful system had been blocked, buried, and forgotten. That distinction mattered. One story led toward replacing everything. The other led toward understanding what was already there before deciding what needed to be replaced. On the first cold morning of October, frost silvered the brown grass along the lane. Elise climbed to the repaired section of the buried channel and checked the last capstone she had reset after the soil dried. It held firm under her boot. She pulled the temporary fence away from the old green band and opened the lower paddock. The 5 cattle walked downhill toward the trough. For months, they had approached that strip and stopped. Now they reached the same place. The oldest cow slowed. She lowered her head, sniffed the ground, shifted her weight forward, and stepped across. The second cow followed, then the steer, then the last 2. No hesitation after that. They moved down the slope toward the concrete trough as if the invisible fence had finally been taken away. Elise stayed where she was and listened. Below them, water kept running into the old trough, 1 quiet inch at a time.